started. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Central Asia Program Seminars. My name is Sébastien Pérouse. I'm a research professor working with the Central Asia Program at the IRIS, so at George Washington University. So today I'm very happy to have this seminar. We're going to discuss a new book entitled Rentier Capitalism and its Discontents, which has been published by Belgrave Macmillan. The full title is Rentier Capitalism and its Discontents, Power, Morality and Resistance in Central Asia. And this is an essential book which addresses multiple development issues, including political, economic, and social development issues in the region, which is a topic that remains insufficiently studied. And as it is written actually in this book, and I think that's in the introduction, I mean, 30 years on, 30 years since independence, it's really time for a critical assessment. And I would say that this book is also more important that it's authored by two of the best scholars working on Central Asia, Balihar Sangera and Elmira Satibaldieva. Elmira today had other commitments, so she cannot be with us today, but we have Balihar who is going to present his book. So Balihar Sangera is a senior lecturer in sociology at University of Kent School of Social Policy, Sociology and Social Research. He has published a lot, including another book entitled Theorizing Social Change in Post-Soviet Countries, Critical Approaches. And Balihar's research interests include social theory, political economy, and ethics. So Balihar will have about 20 minutes to present this book. And after his presentations, we will have two great discussions today. We will start with Asel Tutumlu, who is an assistant professor at Near East University in Northern Cyprus. Asel received her PhD in global affairs from Rutgers State University of New Jersey, and she works on authoritarian regimes in Central Asia and beyond, on democratization, nation building, and foreign policy issues. And she has published many articles in many journals, including Europe-Asia Studies, Central Asian Survey, Journal of Eurasian Studies, Problem of Post-Communism, and also in several edited volumes. And before holding positions in Turkey, Kazakhstan and the United States, Asel worked at the United Nations International Foundation for Election System, at the Kennan Institute for Advanced Russian Studies at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. And last but not least, we'll have David Montgomery, who is a research professor in the Department of Government and Politics and the Center for International Development and Conflict Management at the University of Maryland. David is also the Director of Program Development for CIDR, Communities Engaging with Difference and Religion. His books include Central Asia Context for Understanding, Practicing Islam, Knowledge, Experience and Social Navigation in Kyrgyzstan, Living with Difference, How to Build Community in a Divided World, and Everyday Life in the Balkans. So after David and Asel's discussions, we will have a Q&A session. So please send me your question in the chat box that should be on the right side of your screen. So thank you so much, Balihar, Asel, and David for being with us today. And Balihar, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you for the kind invitation to make our presentation today, and also to thank David and Asel for kindly agreeing to be the discussants. Yeah, just to kind of reiterate, sorry that Amira can't be able to join us today. She just had other commitments. So let me share a short presentation that is based on the book that Amir and I wrote. So let's just see if I can do this. So just bear with me. Okay. Okay, Can people see the slides? Yeah, great. Okay, thank you very much. The book is very much a product of 13 years of fieldwork that Amir and I have undertaken, involving 4 case studies on various sets of issues, and also involving over 240 interviews with state officials, business elites, as well as ordinary working class, middle class families. Amir and I try to do 7 things in this book. The first thing that we try to do is to understand and explain the various forms of suffering and harm that have undertaken in Central Asia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Some of them are new, others exacerbated existing harms. They include things like indebtedness, people taking out huge loans and then struggling to pay them off, lack of adequate housing, resulting in informal settlements, people living in squalor, lack of electricity, water, and even sometimes not being able to have access to education and medical services. The precarity of work has exacerbated since during those 3 decades. But more so, more alarming, is the nature of the environmental pollution and damage that has undertaken in the region. The extreme inequality of wealth and income over the 3 decades. And even morally, if this wasn't enough, then there is the emergence of plutocracy, the rule of the rich. How powerful elites, rich elites, have been able to occupy senior positions at local and national level of political office. This, combined with lack of democratic voice and participation as a result of the disempowerment that has taken place as a result of neoliberalization of the region. And this then also culminates together with the corporate crimes that have been committed in various sectors, financial fraud, violation of regulations in the construction and the real estate sector, and the manipulation of data and environmental rules and regulations in the natural resource sector. The second thing that Amir and I try to do is to argue that income extraction or rent extraction is a significant part of the Central Asian economies. Colleagues will be familiar with rent seeking in the public sector, rightly deemed as illegal, and also will be familiar with natural resource rent. But what tends to get little attention is rent seeking that exists in the private sector, forms such as interest, land and ground rent, capital gains, dividends, fees, and charges. Charges, for example, like utilities, the use of the internet. All these are forms of rent seeking that exist. And what's particularly striking for both myself and Amira is how colleagues in the Central Asian field tend to vilify the first part, the public sector rent seeking, but seemingly celebrate the second or tend to ignore the second. What this book tries to do is to give more attention to the second part because it's just neglected. So while the first part is troubling, so is the second part. So what is rent? Rent is based on power, based on unequal ownership and control of existing scarce assets and resources. So let me give you an example of some of these. So a bank, microfinance institution has a control over credit money, which they then are able to charge exorbitant interest rates over to the borrowers. Likewise, property owners of real estates are able to charge high rent to those who need them, the tenants and other users of housing and real estate sector. And so what we have is a situation in which the rentier class, because these are what these people are, they make money based on existing assets. They don't create new assets because those assets already exist. How these property owners, these rentiers, dominate over the populist class. The third thing that Amir and I do is to draw upon a moral economy perspective. This is to argue that all economies are moral economies, in that economic practices are shaped by norms, moral sentiments, rules that govern how those economic institutions, practices occur. In turn, economic forces, competition, pressures can either reinforce those elements, normative elements, or compromise or override them, usually the latter. And what we've seen in drawing on this perspective is how neoliberalism and its agents, its institutions like the World Bank, IMF, and the European Bank of Development and Reconstruction, the Asian Development Bank, have promoted and morally justified private forms of rent seeking. How have they done this? It is worth noting that during the Soviet Union, rent on earned income was criminalized. It was seen as unproductive form of income. That's why it was outlawed during the Soviet Union. It required new regulations, new legitimations to occur under neoliberalism to make such practices, such rent seeking in the private sector acceptable, normalized. So rule of law and legal and judicial reforms were put in place to make unearned income acceptable, to make rent seeking in the private sector an acceptable part of what is meant, what it was deemed to mean part of the economy. And in also doing so, how the courts, the judiciary, were also enabled and protected the rights of the rentier class. Norms like the sanctity of contracts, honouring one's promises, also became an important part of the moral tools and ideology that were used by the rich and powerful to ensure that the borrowers honoured their debts to the lenders, that the tenants insured were morally insured to honour their contracts and pay on time. And importantly, how the financial elites, as well as the business elites, articulated a moral universe in which the market was seen as a site of individual choice, freedom, and equality. And in wrapping all that up, there was the overarching ideology, discourse around the free market, that the free market works and that this was better than that existed before, the command economy. But it's interesting that this market economy, this free market, was one which limited the control of the state. Now, another part of the moral economy perspective isn't merely to describe and explain how ethics and economy are intertwined, but also to critically evaluate the economic activities in terms of the implications on people's well-being. because we have to explain how economic activities affect people's ability to flourish, their development. If you can't do that, then what is the nature of our critique? And the book tries to explore how usurious interest resulted in people being shamed into making payments, and in many cases losing possession of their assets in order to honor their contracts. How excessive housing rents resulted in many people being homeless because they couldn't afford the rent, or the development of informal settlements. And of course, the expansion of the mining sector and the oil fields in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, resulting in ecocide, damage to the local ecosystem. The fourth thing that we try to do in the book is to highlight the importance of class relations. Class here as not merely sets of attributes that individuals have, but rather as a relational concept. We explore how the rich and the powerful property-owning class, the rentiers, possess and control scarce assets, money, land, natural resources, and access to the internet and other elements that the weak and the powerless lack but need and want for their survival and well-being. It's worth noting here that the property class, the rentiers, are able to make income only because the propertyless class generate that income. And in that way, if the rentiers extract income from the propertyless class, and they do so on the mere basis of owning property rights. That's the mere basis. And it is because of this that their income within political economy is deemed to be unearned income, because they make no effort, no skills are involved, and there's very little labor involved in getting income on the basis of mere owning of property rights. It's also seen as improperty rather than property, because property in the hands of the rentier class is merely used for extraction rather than making useful products. So rent or income extraction involves both class struggle, insofar as the propertyless class and the property class struggle over the rights of property as well as the distribution of rent and income, but also has class effects insofar that the property class, the rentiers, the banks, the landowners, the companies, mobile companies and others, the property construction companies, they are able to increase the concentration of their wealth, but only by impoverishing the working class and the middle classes. The fifth thing that we do in the book is that we employ a Planian double movement to help us to explain how emotional resistance can often become political resistance. We explore in the book, especially in the third part of the book, how social suffering and harms has generated various grassroots movements in the country in response to the neoliberalization and the commodification of key assets such as money, land, and labor. In the book, we explore how Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan saw movements, the emergence of movements such as the anti-debt movement, more rife in Kyrgyzstan than in Kazakhstan, but also how both countries saw things like the land and the housing movements in order to ensure that people had adequate housing and land for their accommodation. But also in response to the natural resource sector, how we saw the development of the environmental movement as well as the labour movements in the region. Now, what's particularly striking is how the state have responded to these grassroots resistance through a mix of accommodation and oppression, co-optation and violence. And in the book, Amer and I give examples of Shanarak and Bishkek, as well as the Janozhen events. The sixth thing that we undertake in the book is to emphasize the crucial role of the state. The state play a vital part in this making of the rentier capitalism, firstly by decriminalizing unearned income, but also signing international investment agreements that protect the rights of foreign investors, undertaking legal and judicial reforms within the country to defend and promote the rights of the property owning class. So in effect, the state has been key in legitimizing improperty or unearned income or rent extraction by creating and instituting a neoliberal regime of property rights. This has been supported by international financial institutions, the World Bank, IMF, the UN, in where the state has been crucial in deregulating, decriminalizing, and desupervising markets, allowing corruption to occur within the various sectors that we explore, the real estate, the finance, as well as the natural resource sector. It's important to understand here, I think, that we don't see by any means that the state merely is an instrument of the capitalist class. I think that that's wrong, and we strongly move away from that. But rather, we argue that the state is a site of struggle of social forces, in which, at this moment in time, the rich and powerful have managed to capture the state and regulatory capacities and resources for their ends. So rather than seeing the state in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan as weak or fragile, actually both Amer and I describe it as debt-fair state, borrowing a term from Susan Soderberg. It is also the state also engages in what we call strategic selectivity, in that it tends to be biased towards transnational capital, though that doesn't mean that it always favors the state. Again, that would be a mistake. It can act against foreign investors for political, social, and electoral reasons. And we saw that recently in the Kumtor gold mine case. And finally, am I doing okay for time, Sebastian? I hope so. Yeah, great. Cheers. So this is the final slide.
Well, I mean, if you could, yeah, you can finish your slides. If you could finish in something like 3 or 4 minutes, that would be perfect.
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah. So this is the final slide where Amer and I examine, evaluate the effects of rentier capitalism. And we look at it along various elements. Firstly, that it has exacerbated immensely wealth and income inequalities. It has resulted, as a result of lack of basic goods for the vast majority of the population, it has contributed to lack of human flourishing and economic development. It has instituted and supported plutocracy at the local and national governance. The and we provide evidence of this in how the national parliament, but also the state city councils are made up of rich individuals. That's what plutocracy means. We explore the explosion of corporate crime, financial fraud that takes place on a regular basis, systematically so. Violations of building and real estate rules in the construction sector, and manipulation, I think, of data that allow predatory mining and drilling to occur in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, deliberately defunding various sectors, independent reports on a toxic level, so that the corporate can continue to drill excessively, which then leads to the ecocide that has taken place, contributing to not only the melting away almost of the glaciers in Kazakhstan, the backdrop that David has of his image there, but also the decimation of the marine life in Kazakhstan. And what we see then, I think, is the emergence of what drawing on other colleagues' work, is the instituting of what we call neoliberal constitutionalism, in which we have the emergence of a global regime of legal and judicial mechanisms that constrain local democratic voices, because the state has to honor its international agreements and in doing so quell the voices that are at the domestic level. But this can't be done for too long, resulting in various protests, revolts, and forms of populism that we've seen in the region. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Balihar. So now we're going to have our two discussants. We're going to start with Asel Tutumlu, and Asel will be followed with David Montgomery. Just I would like to repeat, because I saw that some people connected during Balihar's presentation. I just want to say that after Asel and David discussion, we're going to have a Q&A session. So please don't hesitate to send me your questions in the chat box, so that you and we'll collect the question. Thank you so much. So, Asel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So first of all, I would like to congratulate Elmira and Balihar for the wonderful work. As I've said before, it's a culmination of a really extensive field work that you guys conducted, and I think it's a wonderful product at the end. To me, rather than summarizing what particular the book was about, since Balihar already talked about it, I just wanted to highlight 5 different things that actually struck me, and I think will be very useful for readers, both not only in the area studies, but a really wide range of people who are involved in issues of democratization, economic development, corruption, comparative cases between countries. So when I finished reading the book, it kind of made me mad. I was thinking that I mean, this is the story that puts so many different things together in a very powerful argument that basically states that it's a global story of harm conducted by neoliberal form of capitalism. And it just uses Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan as case studies to explain basically the nature and the outcomes of the processes, the political economy, let's say, that we are living in. To me, one of the things that were very striking, and I think it's very interesting that you've done that, it really expanded the notion of rent. I mean, we are very much familiar with the idea of rentier capitalism that basically also tries to explain the notion, the link between rents, economic rents, regimes, and democratization. But the fact that you've included and really kind of unpacked and showed how the mechanisms that makes these rents possible was really, really interesting to me. Going beyond financial, land rents, natural resource rent, natural monopoly rents, spectrum rents, contract rents, and the platform rents. I mean, these are just some of the things that were just so illuminating. And I think it actually shows that it's not really just a natural resource, but it's the really this internationalization of global capital in line and together with the local political and economic elites that creates this very kind of system that is so impenetrable and so dominating that it's very difficult to break down. I just recently saw that Anne Applebaum calls it authoritarian incorporation, and it really is. It's really an authoritarianism that is incorporated, and it's global. It also, what was also interesting to me, and it wasn't really that present in Balihar's presentation, that it's not only that we are not, plutocracy is not the only thing that happens, right? But you actually also use this very cool term called criminogency, right? And improperty. And it actually creates not only the openness or a possibility of corruption, but it's the whole system that fosters the opportunities for crime. And it's just the nature of the game. It's not something that is a kind of a collateral damage, but it's actually created for certain reasons. It was also interesting to me to read this book because you are very much reflecting how people have felt on the ground. And I think you call it Southern perspective, which I think also will be very interesting to people who work on the region or in the region, where Southern perspective for you had a very, very peculiar understanding, right? And it's very much in line with the current decolonial trend that is in vogue in Central Asian studies. And it was very interesting to me to see that you have not only said that it's a particular method, right? But you've elaborated it, basically talking about the fact that Southern standpoint involves abstracting significant attributes and relations from multidimensional concrete social phenomena. And you are able to explore this complexity through Polanyi's framework by reviving the notion of class, which was very interesting and useful. And in addition to that, by doing so, you're not really relying on the classical kind of Marxist material production type of processes, right? But you're also including the intelligence of emotion, ethical descriptions, evaluations, and most importantly, which was very interesting to me, is this idea of reproduction. That it's not only just induction or the deduction that we usually approach when we conduct our research, but it's a constant kind of reflexivity where you go back and forth. And I think that reflexivity actually enabled you to really provide space for people who haven't been heard before. And I think representing these people's voices and as equal agents, as people who have the right to speak and they have the valid moral reasons, it is very important because frequently we don't necessarily see them as equal. We see them as people who have violated the rules and are basically trying to do their best to survive. And it's also the Southern perspective for you also involves intensive rather than extensive approach. And by concentrating on the fictitious commodities, you were able to really zoom in on the struggles that are not really broad and encompassing, but only the struggles that are related to land, labor, money, which was very, very important. Another thing that I wanted to highlight was the after reading the book, you kind of inverted the way people thought about, so to say, commonly thought good things that are supposed to happen. I mean, in your book, it's very provocative book, and it basically inverts commonly held beliefs that good governance, legal compliance, sanctity of contracts, individual responsibility, these are usually seen as good things. And you're basically saying, you and Elvira are basically saying, no, I mean, you saying good governance creates the rentier possibility. it is an essential part, actually, of neoliberal capitalism, and that needs to be really unpacked. Another thing that was also important to me is that you were able, by using the Southern perspective, you were able to really kind of very elegantly navigate between different levels of analysis, which I really appreciated. So at times, you would actually explain certain positions of the official positions of states from the perspective of kind of center periphery, where there is an embedded inequality, but at the same time, you also, in this complex story, you don't necessarily forget that these particular states are made of specific people with certain interests. Investors are made of specific people with interests. So you basically put the names to processes, and you revealed it in multiple tables of ownership and how exactly power and plutocracy operates in the field. It was also interesting to see the wealth of data on specific contracts, how it all put into the same place. So, for example, the story about specific activities, practices, instruments of both the government and the investors, their contracts, the specific terms of contracts, and the development of the story, all of that in one place was really, really nice to read. And the last thing that, not least, that I wanted to talk about is that I think Polanyi's framework is not only very kind of in vogue today, but it is so useful to really obtain critique of neoliberal capitalism that has been established in pretty much around the world today. And particularly, you've also talked about it, that Polanyi's framework enables you to revive the notion of class beyond the standard, and in that sense, you speak to a very wide literature. It also redefined the notion of state, which we've already talked about, by using Bob Jessup's idea that it's a site of struggle. It offered a contrast of justice claims. And I think in that sense, it was also very important because you not only represent the morality, basically a comparison, but you basically embed this comparison into the field, into the case, and you show how that particular moral claims played out, not only just discursively, but actually in practice, using the instruments and practices of state, mass media, stones for that matter, right? Bullets as well. And so it was very interesting to see that it's not just invaders, grabbers, barbarians, right? But it's the land for living, it's the traditional claim, it's the usury. It was very important to see that moral claim in each case of the book that talks about fictitious commodities. So I have some questions for the future, if you don't mind, or shall I do them? Shall I ask them later? Sebastian?
No, go ahead. That's no problem.
Okay. So to me, what was interesting is that, and here I'm coming from a very old work of Jean Baudrillard, who remember talked about different ideas of different kind of in the ideological creation of needs, right? The use value, different ideas of value. And your story makes a very compelling argument that fictitious commodities are basically happen when the use value is turned into the exchange value. And that also facilitates a certain power network, right? And the legal mechanisms around it, which you call the neoliberal constitutionalism. And it's a very global kind of phenomena. But to me, there were other value mechanisms that may be important to highlight, and I would be very much interested in hearing what your thoughts about it, because a lot of times when we think about the things that I mean, capitalism came to the region, and it was understood as a matter of status and as a matter of differentiation. So status value was very important for people. And in that sense, do you think it was indeed a kind of preordained or predetermined plan by the investors and the political elites that enabled normalization of this type of capitalism? And therefore, if so, well, that was one of the biggest successful PR campaigns ever in history, right? Or was it actually a kind of a spirit of time, a kind of a normal historical progression that translated these cultural values into the economic system that was established? So my question is kind of about the chicken and an egg, and I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about it. Now, and I also have the thoughts about the groups of social movements, and I know that David is probably going to talk more about it. And just to kind of, because I cannot really pass this opportunity. I mean, I'm interested in what exactly, how do you see the future of political change? Simply because a lot of these movements are very much illiberal, right? They don't necessarily, I mean, there are some rights-based movements, and you've illustrated in several cases. But in many cases, the movements that appear to challenge this privileged status of foreign investors, for example, are very much populist, and they are honestly scary. So I would be interested to see what you think about it. So again, thank you for the great book, and it was really a pleasure of reading it and participating in this forum. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Estelle. Baliha, if you don't mind, I know Estelle asked questions, but if you don't mind, I'm gonna give the floor to David, who might have some questions too, and then you will have time to answer. Okay, all right, thanks. So David, the floor is yours.
Sure, thanks Sebastian, and Estelle, thanks for your comments as well. I'll try to pick up on some of those. And Balihar, as you know, congratulations to both you and Almira. I think it's a great book. So my comments, in some ways, I'll try to be brief given the time, but in some ways I think they pick up a little bit on Estelle's question about the future of political change, because that really was what struck me about the book as a whole. I mean, I think it's a sad story. It's a damning story. It has an agenda. It's an angry book. In I think the best of possible ways, right? I mean that as a good thing, right? Because it's highlighting injustice, and it has a very impassioned agenda. I think, you know, Estelle does a good job characterizing the sense that the data is pretty thorough, and you know, you don't walk away. I think, you know, it's not that there's a whole lot of questions, I think, in the way that's presented, and in some ways the format's it's academic. I mean, you can, you know, it's an article style with connected pieces. You can read the chapters separately, which I think works for the prolonged sort of emphasis of making the case, right? The argument. But it's different than sort of a pamphlet manifesto type of product, right? Which is sort of initially where I thought about, right? The pieces on Feuerbach, right? You know, not just interpreting, but changing the world. And there is some of that real effort around trying to think through change. I think that's a bit less developed. It comes in at the end a bit, but what you're doing really is sort of setting a foundation. It's descriptive of the economic transition, and I think it's wise. I think it's appropriate as well to sort of frame that in moral terms, that transition in moral terms. And it's, you know, not only what was lost, but also what was gained, and the fact that it was gained in very uneven ways. I think that, you know, the general challenge of the book, as you claim, is sort of looking to global equitable development, right? And you're using, in some ways, you're using the case of Central Asia as a heuristic for really a much larger problem, and you know, pointing out sort of the forces that push back on that, and like I said, I think that what's interesting is, in some ways, it's very sociological in its orientation, which makes sense. You draw upon, the moral economist. I mean, there's a strong presence, as Estelle talks about, in terms of Polanyi. You talk about Tani a lot, which I appreciate. And there's even a sense, as I was sort of reading through it. I mean, there was very much a sense for me of sort of the agenda of the Birmingham's Center on Contemporary Cultural Studies, right? Not only of describing things, but having an analysis accomplish something. And part of what you do is you lay out a picture of how the structures have come to be accepted as normal. I think that this is pretty important, and I think that the part of the challenge really is sort of the next step, right? And this is not really a critique of the book itself, but it's one that I really struggle with, and I think that certainly there will be some people who disagree with the moralization of the critique. I don't. I think that that's the right approach personally, because I do think we have to see these things in those types of terms. But I think that you make it harder for, I mean, if someone is entering the book objectively, then it pushes them to look at the data and assess really where they are, right? If they're being open about it, if they disagree with that. But what I struggle with, and again, it's not necessarily a critique of the book, because I think the research, like I said, is very solid. But how do we translate from knowledge of things to knowledge for things? And my sense from the book and reading it is that you've done you both have done a very good job sort of characterizing the dilemma and the rootedness of the problem, and the struggles that counter hegemonic anti-neoliberal efforts face, and I think that the challenge, for all of us in some ways to think through is not merely to describe, but then how do we operationalize that to to addressing what is, I think, your underlying interest, which is how to make people's lives a bit better. I think that given time, I'll just sort of stop at that. But I think that for me, it opened up a broader question of a very damning critique of the struggles and sufferings that people are sort of working through, and left us with the problem, like how do we start to help? How do we start to address? So I'll turn it over to you and others for questions.
Thank you so much, David. So maybe Balihar, you want to answer Asel and David comments, and Asel has some questions. So I'm going to give you some time actually.
Okay. Well, firstly, let me just thank Asel and David for their very generous comments, and I really do appreciate that you enjoyed the book that Amir and I wrote. It was a product of many anxieties and a lot of heartaches, as you rightly point out. I suppose the question that you're asking is about where do we go from here? I mean, how do we then produce change? And I think I can't remember. I think we end the book with a quote from Gramsci: the pessimism of the will, pessimism of the mind and optimism of the will. I suppose this is a dilemma that as social scientists we all face in terms of how do we then try to put forward a more progressive and pragmatic agenda by which to ensure that we don't merely describe the world, but also, as David pointed out, to change it. And I think one of the ways that we can do, and in many ways agree with what Asel was saying, is about how we approach research in the first place. All too often we approach research with disciplinary blinkers. So we kind of confine ourselves to our constraints of what we are comfortable with. So if we are anthropologists, we work on anthropology. If we're IR specialists, then we work with just IR, etc., etc. I think one of the things that both Amir and I want to advocate in terms of the first steps is to go for a post-disciplinary perspective in which we are not merely constrained by scholarship of where we find ourselves, whether it be sociology, economics, political science, etc., but to offer a more, as I said, post-disciplinary perspective that encourages us to undertake the kind of activity that Asel was saying, employing, taking seriously the concerns, evaluations of the people that we interview, the first-person perspective rather than all too often the spectator's view. But in terms of the issue around change, how do we take the steps towards bringing about a better world? I think also it's also a question, I think, David, about the other binaries that we ought to often work in social science between is and ought. These are false binaries. They get blurred. All too often, what we are doing is not merely describing the world, but we're also saying how the world ought to be. And here we have to be attuned to the voices of the people, of our interlocutors, the people that we are interviewing, because they sometimes may have good ideas. They may not all be, as I saw you were saying, they may not be necessarily the ones that you feel comfortable with, but we have to be attuned to their concerns. That's not to say that what people articulate are infallible. We're all fallible. We all make mistakes. We don't have a perfect sense of our surroundings. So I think it's to build in fallibility of our participants, ourselves, and to understand that this is a reflexive process in which we try to achieve a more better world. And this is one in which, drawing on Nancy Fraser, she talks about not the double movement, but the triple movement, in which you bring in not only those who've been disempowered by neoliberalization, but also those who've been empowered by it. Those who, for example, women, people of ethnicities, will find market a form of liberation because it moves away some of those patriarchal constraints that existed before. So I think it's a discussion that inevitably has to happen, in which you bring about all the different sides together. But overarching all this is our sense of what it means for human flourishing. This isn't subjective. This isn't merely opinions, but is based on what we know to result in human flourishing for all. And all too often, when we think about ethics or morality, we tend to reduce it to mere subjective opinions. I think this is a mistake as well, for us to understand that if people are mistaken about their notion of the good, the right, it's because we know what things work well for human development. I hope that kind of gives you a flavor of how we try to answer that question.
Thank you very much, Baliha. We have a question related to the voice of the propertyless in Central Asia. Do you think that the poor do not have any agency in Central Asia? And if good governance is not that good, then what is the alternative? How can we increase the voice of the propertyless in the context of authoritarianism in Central Asia?
Great question. I suppose one of the things that we try to articulate in the book is not that the poor groups, the working class, don't have agency. They clearly do have agency. Otherwise, they wouldn't be able to undertake the kind of movements that they developed. But also to understand the vulnerabilities that they have, right? And I think this is as important. All too often we talk about agency, but also I think we also have to pay equal attention to why it is that they are forced to undertake action. It's because they are vulnerable beings who have been harmed by the various social economic practices. And in that context, I think Asel was right talking about the intelligent emotions, the emotional resistance that they have to inequalities, to suffering. So it's understanding not only the agency, but also the vulnerabilities. But yes, agency in the context of unequal power relations, in which you have sometimes the state acting on behalf of the transnational capital, suppressing and violently suppressing movements, as we saw like in Zhanaozen, but also in other places as well, like Shanarak in 2005, and also using forms of discreditation of movement leaders, especially women leaders. I mean, this is the other thing that I think that Omar and I tried to show, that gender is also an equal part of this story, in which how the media portray the leaders as unfeminine, lacking motherhood, not being that they somehow didn't belong in the public sphere, and I think it's trying to understand the structures in which this occurs, but to recognize people, working class people, women, the poor do take agency because they have to. That's the only thing they've got to do, is to resist. What else can you do? But whether emotional resistance becomes political resistance, or whether and then political resistance becomes successful, these are all highly contingent factors. And I think that's the kind of study that Amir and I want to do next.
Thank you so much. Asel, David, you want to add anything on these questions? No, I mean, it's not mandatory, not at all. I just wanted to give you a chance. Okay.
Maybe, well, I just wanted to
sure.
I just wanted to say that I mean, the fact that you put Nancy Fraser, you mentioned Nancy Fraser, makes a very big difference. And I think her ideas of affirmative, the difference between affirmative versus transformative solutions, it should be your next can be potentially your answer to all the questions about it, because I think that's I mean, being critical in offering the vision, right, would necessarily involve certain revision of positionalities of people in comfort, and it's inevitable. And I think the fact that you're bringing in the ecological dimension, you're bringing in the inequality, you're bringing in plutocracy and kleptocracy together, makes these particular necessity, I mean, this makes the reevaluation of the existing forms of capitalism a necessity, not necessarily a privilege of academic circles anymore.
Yeah. I think maybe just to add, I mean, part of what you're advocating for is revolutionary change and how this takes place, right? And I think there's, people often forget about the pains that revolutions impart on populations, which a lot of people die. They're often very hard, and I think the challenge to think through, especially from a moral lens, is how to transition or how to bring about change in ways that ideally are less violent and less bloody.
Thank you, David. I mean, maybe just a last question, maybe also on the step further. I mean, again, Balihar, you write such an impressive analysis on all the impact of this neoliberal economic system, how it resulted in economic and social insecurity, in debt sometimes, and as Asel said, even in violence in Central Asia. The question is, what would be some alternative models? Do you consider, for example, the BRI or the Eurasian Economic Union as alternative models? For example, both Russia and China have criticized the Washington Consensus, and China, with the BRI, openly promotes a Beijing Consensus versus Washington consensus, meaning a countermodel to the Western system that it said, it would be dysfunctional. And at the same time, the Eurasian Economic Union and the BRI are significantly criticizing. More and more Central Asian people raise questions on the impact of the BRI on the economic autonomy on Central Asia. So how would these alternative models differ actually from the Washington consensus? Do you consider them in a way as really alternative models?
Oh, great! Another great set of questions there. Both Amir and I initially thought the BRI and the Eurasian Economic Union offered alternatives, but I think in the cold light of day we came to realize that they weren't offering anything which was radically alternative to the Washington consensus. Their rhetoric may be one of productive capital and moving away from rentierism, but in reality, they are as invested. China and Russia are as invested in rent extraction, natural resources, finance, as United States and the European countries. So I don't think we necessarily see those two alternative economic imaginaries as a solution. The kind of imaginary that we would like to see is one that pays due respect and due concern to climate change, one in which we have to undertake some sort of radical change in our production and consumption. It involves one in which the Northern Hemisphere, the North American, European countries degrowth. They reduce their production and consumption, and one in which you have the southern states, so the Southern Hemisphere states, the developing countries, increase theirs to a convergence to that of the Northern Hemisphere. So I think the model that we would want to have is one that seriously takes into account the climate change and the importance that we cannot have a model of development which continues to extract resources in of oil and gas and other minerals, but also one which ensures that you do have flourishing, greater equality, especially for those in the Southern Hemisphere.
Okay, thank you so much. But unfortunately, we have to finish. We could go on this discussion. After Baliar's presentation and Marcel and David's discussion, it really highlights how rich this book is. How many issues it addresses. So I would really strongly encourage you to read it, to buy it. I can tell you that you really won't waste your time. On the contrary, the book is, I think, easily accessible, and you can buy it on most of regular websites, and you can even get an electronic version. So thank you so much, Baliar. Thank you so much, Asel and David, for your discussion, and thank you to everyone who attended your presentation today, and we look forward to having you in our next Central Asia Program seminar. Thank you very, very much. Have a good evening or have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.